The first session is on analytics to support planning. We have three speakers. The whole idea, as Emma mentioned, is to give a snapshot of all the different kinds of research that TAL has been undertaking. So our first presenter is Diego de Silva. We've got Dr. Diego Silva has a PhD in computer science and is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Transit Analytics Lab. His research bridges between public transit and cutting-edge computational methods to build better and more reliable urban mobility in cities. We've asked each of the speakers to give a personal note as well. So Diego adds he is also a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and when he's not researching, he is at the U of T dojo teaching self-defense and how to break bones using the gentle art. Whoa. Okay, Diego, why don't you take the screen?
Okay, thank you.
And we'll sort of follow time. We're really pressed for time, but we'll try to answer some questions. If anybody has questions, please put them in the Q&A box, not the chat room, the Q&A box. And then if we don't get to them during the session, the speakers can answer them independently. Thank you.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Yes.
Yeah, you can start again.
Just a minute. Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction, Brendon. Today I will present our research to estimate an origin destination matrix for the TTC subway system using Wi-Fi and AFC data. So this presentation is the final expanded version of our paper we presented at TRB this year. Okay. So I want to start defining an OD matrix and its importance in transport planning. The OD matrix is a data structure that maps trips to each origin-destination pair in a given region. So the matrix can represent trips for different purposes, such as work, education, shopping, and social trips. In addition, we can generate an OD matrix for a time of the day or by mode, for example, bus, subway, or automobile. And its primary application is to support engineers, urban planners, and transit policymakers in understanding distributions and demand patterns. Okay. One of the most well-known efforts to consolidate a regional OD matrix is the Transportation Tomorrow Survey, or TTS, here in Canada. So the TTS is a large-scale survey to estimate patterns of origin destinations from households through online interviews or phone calls. Yeah, by the way, I filled out my form this weekend, which is interesting. So the survey is carried out every 5 years, and the final result takes some months to be published. So from a practical perspective, that's a long time, considering so many changes transit has been going through, especially after COVID. So I will go over here some of our goals. So Wi-Fi data have the potential to produce a reliable and cost-effective OD matrix. So Wi-Fi data represents a subgroup of riders, so it's not a total, and suffers connectivity issues. So that's why we'll discuss a little bit how we solve this problem. And this work develops a method for generating OD matrix for entry-only transit systems based on Wi-Fi and AFC gate count. And in order to validate our method, we use the 2016 TTS as a baseline for comparison. Okay. Our method is divided into four main tasks, so which I will explain later in more detail. So the task one is the data collection. So we have Wi-Fi and AFC gate count as the main data source. The task two, which is the data engineering step, which encompasses the data imputation method. The step three, which is the seed matrix generation, which is the matrix that contains the spatial demand distribution. and the task 4, matrix balancing, which is the process of balancing the columns and rows of the OD matrix. Okay, so the figures, this figure illustrates how Wi-Fi data are collected. So first, AFC. So I start with AFC. So AFC is a well-known data source. It is the number of people crossing the gate barrier. So the AFC gate count provides the ground truth data in the matrix balancing step. So it's just the number of passengers. And this is provided by the TTC, by the way. So passengers, and now the Wi-Fi. So passengers wishing to use the Wi-Fi network for the first time, so must connect and authenticate their devices with the service provider. So here in Toronto is the BAI communications, which we store the service set identifier, which is the SSID. After this initial connection, the registered device will always connect to the provider's access points, regardless of future authentication or active internet connection. So the provider creates a log for each device association through the metadata collected, including the timestamp, the access point identification, and the device media access control, or the MAC address. So that's why we can identify the device on the network. And the metadata gathered for each user's device are grouped into origin destination segments from the first arrival until it exceeds more than 50 minutes away from the limits of the network. Okay, so, but in practice, not all access points can establish a connection. So that's why we see some gaps in the device traceability, mainly at the platform level. So in some cases, the gap appears at the station level, so we cannot confirm whether the passenger alighted at the station on the last station platform visited by the user, or the last timestamp. And that's why we need to define what is an ideal trip. So the ideal trip obeys an ordered sequence of no repeating timestamps. So following a path, like showing here, like I show here in the picture. So we start from the time 1, which is the origin start time, pass through the origin platform time. So we have the timestamp at the platform level, then the destination platform time, and finally disconnects at the concourse or street level of the destination station. Okay, so as mentioned, due to connection loss, some inconsistencies in timestamp values may happen. In this way, repeated timestamps values for any time intervals were considered inconsistent. So for example, if you have, for example, 2 timestamps with the same values, so this will not follow the consistency that we described, which is the temporal order. For this reason, we developed a step for data imputation. So we categorized the Wi-Fi trajectories into 4 classes. So the first one is the complete trips, with both origin destination are time consistent, and complete origin and incomplete destination. So the origin is time consistent and destination is inconsistent. Complete destination and incomplete origin is the opposite. And the incomplete origin and destination, both origin and destination are time inconsistent. Okay, except for the class where origin and destination are complete, all other types are candidates for the imputation step. So the imputation method consists of 2 logical verification steps. So the first one examines whether in the last 30 days the user had at least 1 origin destination pair equal to the trip classified as inconsistent. If the trip was identified in the historical list of origin destination pairs, the respective station is imputed. If the pair was not identified for each user, we have a list of origins and another list of destinations. So the second step was to check whether the origin or destination encompasses the known stations within the disaggregated list. Thus, trips that failed to verify the user's origin and destination's historical data were added to the discarded pool. Okay, So as described on the slide, so the seed matrix stores the spatial distribution or the trips of each OD pairs. So this matrix will be multiplied by the origin vector. So we store this information from the AFC gate counts. So this process results in an unbalanced matrix that will be the input for the balance step. So to solve this balancing matrix, we implemented the growth vector doubly constraint model. The algorithm balances the matrix from the sum of its rows and columns. So at each alternating iteration between origin destinations, we calculate the approximation of the vectors concerning the ground truth data or AFC data. This process is repeated until the growth vector is equal to 1 and the difference of the sums of origins and destinations is 0, which is the initial condition of the OD matrix. So this slide is just to illustrate the same pipeline in mathematical notation. So we have here on the left the C matrix, then we multiply by the origin vector, then we have the unbalanced matrix. Then we have the iterative step, which is the matrix balancing. And this step follows some tasks here. So the balancing step, the growth vectors, the matrix state update, and the error minimization. Okay, to validate the method, we collected data from weekdays from September 24th to September 30th. So 5 days, 5 days in 2021 in the morning peak. In addition, we aggregated subway stations into regions because the TTS matrix was too sparse at the station level. So it's better to compare when you aggregate in regions. So they highlighted region 1 represents downtown. So in the morning peak is the main trip attraction zone. So, okay, so in the chart, we see that Wi-Fi captures approximately 34% of AFC data trips or data counts without discarding. The final result after imputation is 30%, which is the 44 plus 41% times the 134,000 trips. So also we generated 3 models from this data. So we have the model 1, which is complete trips only. So just recalling the classification of each trip. The model 2, which is the complete trip plus imputed trips, and the model 3, no trip filter. Okay, so now I will present the results. So the heat map shows that the trip distributions are proportionally similar. Moreover, most travel destinations are concentrated in region 1, which is downtown. So the largest employment hub in the city and the location with the highest concentration of financial, cultural, entertainment, and educational institution. TTS tends to overestimate demand in region 1. So the proportion of trips is higher in all destinations. So the region 7, for example, to downtown pair is 2.5 times higher in TTS. So the performance of the models was above 70% for the coefficient of determination. In addition, the running time was below the computational running time was below 1 second, so 0.63 seconds. And the convergence occurred in less than 5 iterations with an error close to 0. So this demonstrates the practical application of the model. So to check the geometric similarity, we calculate the cosine of similarity both in the columns and in the row vector space. So recollecting that our cosine similarity close to 1 indicates that the vectors are similar. So we can assume that the models are equivalent to the TTS. So as you can see, the origin destination is 0.9, 0.99, so it's close to 1. We also analyzed the variability of the expansion factor, and the values remained stable, which is a good sign, as we can scale the Wi-Fi matrix by using some numbers. So in this case, for example, using the model 1, we scale and by 6, and the model 2 by 4, and the model 3 by 3. Okay. The coefficient of variation was higher, mainly in the counterflow. As you can see, the region 8, 9, 10, so they are in the border of the system. And the sparsity of the matrix was concentrated in the most peripheral stations of the subway system. Recalling, we are evaluating the morning peak, so that's why we see more variation on peripheral stations. Okay. And this is analysis at the station level. So the station level revealed that in the morning peak, the demand presents patterns of symmetry. So in the example, Bathurst follows the demand pattern of neighboring stations. So this type of symmetry is relevant in the design of learning algorithms that we will discuss in another presentation. Okay. So to summarize, the Wi-Fi-based OD matrix shows patterns similar to the TTS and can be used as a reasonable proxy. So changes in the travel pattern can explain the higher CV coefficient of variation values of passengers during the pandemic. The results showed that the possibility of generating OD matrices at finer time scales, for example, at the station level, if the EFC data are available. And the actual process is ad hoc and can be generalized using learning methods. So this is everything.
That's great, Diego. Thank you very much. Question, if I understand correctly, despite the fact that you're only getting a percentage of observations through the validation tools, you've been able to make it comparable to the ground truth and TTS with much less computational time compared to processing huge travel survey information. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, it's not a fair comparison because TTS is encompasses the different modes as well. So here we are focused on
single mode.
Yeah. But if you think like in the time like computational process, yes, less than once.
That's amazing. Now, I guess a lot of people will wonder, okay, this is for the subway where you had turnstile data, but most transit systems have buses. Do you think this kind of methodology will be applicable to buses as well?
Yes, is applicable as well. So the method is quite simple. So the only thing that we need is data that will validate the ground truth, and then we can approximate by using the Wi-Fi data. So as you can see, with 30% was a reasonable amount of data to approximate really well the TTS.
Gotcha. Yeah, but it requires public Wi-Fi on the buses as a starting point.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So okay, so a lot of systems don't have that, but still, it's an interesting. It would be an interesting extra benefit from putting on board, putting Wi-Fi on board. So
yeah, and I think one of the benefits is that our starting point is from the transit system. Yeah, so the TTS is from the households. So we are close to the
closer to the actual behavior.
Yeah. Yes.
We have time, I think, for one more question. We have one that's been asked. The accuracy of the Wi-Fi OD matrix relies on how many passengers choose to connect to the Wi-Fi station. I would like to know your thoughts on the applicability of the presented method to other regions where people might be skeptical about connecting to the station's Wi-Fi.
So, yeah, could you repeat?
So basically, it requires people to have registered or to logged on to the Wi-Fi, but people may be, for privacy reasons or whatever, may not log on. Would it still be usable?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, we have a very good approximation only by capturing 30% of the ground truth data.
Total population,
Yeah. So we actually think that we don't need like many people connecting. So 30% is a good proxy for good results as well. Okay. So just to complement this question.
Yeah.
In this case, the Wi-Fi data, the user doesn't need, for example, the user, he or she doesn't need to connect every time. So the Wi-Fi network, if you connect at least one time, is able to identify you.
It still recognizes you whether you log on
as long as you're in the range of within the network access points.
Right, gotcha. Yeah, and that's very useful. Okay, well, thank you very much, Diego. We'll move on. Next speaker is Roger Chen. And Roger is a master's candidate in the Department of Civil Mineral Engineering, working with Professor Emmer Shalaby at the Transit Analytics Lab. His research focuses on exploring how subway ridership is recovering after COVID by analyzing Wi-Fi data records. Personal note, in his spare time, he enjoys cycling and playing the clarinet. Roger. Yay. Good, we see you.
Thank you, Brendon, for the introduction. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Excellent. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my presentation titled Trends in Transit Ridership Recovery, Insights from Subway Wi-Fi Records. My name is Roger. As Brendon said, I'm a first-year Master of Applied Science student here in Civil Engineering, working with Alaa and Alaa. And today I'll be talking a little bit about my research into the DTC's subway Wi-Fi data. I'll be showcasing a few interesting exploratory analyses we've conducted, and I'll be discussing some potential next steps for our work. So to begin, I think it's clear to all of us that transit has been dramatically affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't think I need to convince anyone here of that fact. But one of the biggest changes was changes in ridership and travel patterns. And one of the hardest sectors there was downtime-focused commuting. And that also happens to be one of the biggest ridership drivers in the GTA before COVID, at least. So based on that, one important question I'll be looking at in this presentation is to try and look at how and why travel demand is evolving, focusing but not exclusively looking at downtown Toronto specifically. To this end, we're going to be leveraging Wi-Fi data provided by BAI, Rogers, and I'll also be talking a little bit about how well this data compares with actual reported stats and trends to verify how well this data matches actual ridership. And doing this by presenting some visualizations of some of the preliminary analysis that we've conducted to date. Beyond this presentation, in terms of the ultimate results of our research, we want to, first of all, continue to monitor and model the ridership recovery. We want to also continue to build our understanding of this data source to try and build some more complicated models that integrate Wi-Fi data with other potential data sources to build a more complete picture of where and how and why this ridership is returning. And the end state that we're looking towards is to develop some kind of a tool that will allow transit agencies that have this Wi-Fi data available to them to really monitor and forecast certain trends that allowing them to be a lot more agile in responding to evolving demand and leveraging this data to aid in service planning, marketing, and establishing priorities for continuing recovery and growth. So, why Wi-Fi? As it turns out, for this specific research, Wi-Fi data has several advantages over more traditional data sources. So, first of all, one of the big things is that Wi-Fi data is collected passively across the system. So, the benefit is we can get a lot of data very cheaply, very quickly, and with almost no direct labor cost, unlike traditional ridership accounts and surveys. We can also track individual devices through the trip. So as Diego talked about, so we can get a lot of information about individuals' origins, destinations, as well as the exact route through the system that they used in terms of which lines and which stations. We can also track devices between trips, so not just through one trip, but on different days, we can see different trips made by the same device. So that allows us to look at people's travel habits and allows us to answer questions about things like how often they travel, their patterns in where and when people travel in terms of, for example, time of day, different parts of the city, weekdays versus weekends, and so on. Another advantage is that the Wi-Fi data can be set up in a way to be updated continuously or in near real time, or have very frequent data jumps. This allows agencies to see and respond to changes in demand patterns very quickly rather than relying on things like counts or passenger complaints or operator complaints to know when there's an issue with service. Records are also anonymized, which helps mitigate some privacy concerns that compared with like credit card taps, like custo cards, which you can tie to someone's account. Finally, we find that Wi-Fi records are on the whole actually a decent proxy for local ridership, at least on the TTC system. And the benefit of this is that this allows us to draw some stronger conclusions from the Wi-Fi data than we may be able to, and also helps make calculation easier for when we dive deeper and do some more complicated, more detailed analyses on data. So this presentation is titled Trends in Transit Recovery. So let's jump in and talk about that first. Here we are showing system-wide recovery to pre-COVID conditions with the officially reported TTC stats in green and the percentage we calculated from device records in yellow. And I think it's pretty clear immediately that there's a pretty remarkable match between them, showing that on aggregate, these Wi-Fi records can be a decent proxy for ridership overall. Of course, it's not a perfect match, and there's still need for calibration at like a station level. But the overall capture rate on the TTC for these trips line up that on aggregate, at least they do correlate very well. If we also add downtown office occupancy rates in blue, we can see that, as I'm sure many of us are aware, downtown focused commuting is lags quite a bit behind, about 20% or so behind overall system-wide recovery, as we know. So we see that a positive trend, and so let's think about where this ridership increase is coming from. So I'm sure we're all aware that there's been a push recently throughout the entire pandemic, really, for employees, especially office employees, to return to the office, to go from, so it might be reasonable to think that people are increasing how often they're going to the office, like from 0 or to 1 day a week to 2 days a week to 3 days a week to so on. Now, we can actually investigate this question with our Wi-Fi data because we can calculate how frequently a given device is seen at a given station at a given time period. We have calculated this chart that shows how many times per week devices enter the subway in the downtown core stations, so Queen, King, Union, St. Andrew, Osgood, between the and rush hour from 3 to 7 p.m. all over a typical week. So even before COVID, we can see that, first of all, only a small fraction of riders were actually using the subway, or was at least observed in the subway all 5 days a week, with about 3 days a week being average. After COVID, that has changed to fluctuate between about 2 to 2.5 days a week. And that figure, more importantly, has held steady for pretty much the entire duration of the pandemic. And it suggests that at least until fall 2022, which is when we have the latest reliable data, we can see that people still aren't going to the office that frequently, and the average number of trips per week has not increased, has not really been increasing. This is just focused on downtown, but we've also done similar analysis for other stations throughout the city, and we found generally similar findings, suggesting that overall, everywhere for individuals, commuting travel habits largely have held steady. We can also use Wi-Fi data to estimate how many individual users are traveling by counting how many unique devices are entering the system. So if we compare the line in red, which is a recovery in terms of unique devices that we see in a typical month, we can see that the number of unique devices, which we assume is closely related to the number of unique riders, has been increasing very faster than the number of trips made overall. If we put all this together, we can see that the ridership is really most closely associated with the number of unique users, and it's sort of not at all associated with how frequently those people are actually traveling. So based on this, we can conclude that the TTC's ridership increases have been driven in large part by more people using the system, but each of them using the system less frequently than they did before COVID, as opposed to the same user base using the system more frequently. So this is the kind of really interesting question about subway usage, about recovery that we can use as Wi-Fi data to help answer, and which in turn can help inform things like service planning, marketing to try and get as many people back on transit as possible. So returning to the question of where and when these riders are returning, we can also compare downtown to the rest of the city and also recovery trends on weekdays versus weekends. So we can see that across the city, weekends have seen much higher degree of recovery than weekday travel. With last summer, there's some weekends where ridership was even approaching or even exceeding 100% of pre-COVID levels. Whereas for weekdays, we can see that it's lagging behind a little bit. Downtown has been started at around 20% from 2020 to early 2021, and that's recovered and stabilized at about 60% for downtown. And then in the rest of the city has been following the same sort of shape, but running about 10% higher. And that's also held steady for the entire pandemic. And once again, this highlights, that we all know how downtown commuting has been one of the slowest sectors to return. It's probably not a surprising finding to most of you here, these trends. And it is broadly consistent with what agencies across the GTA, across Canada and America have been reporting. The more relevant takeaway here is that this further highlights the credibility of this Wi-Fi data as a data source, since we're getting very similar conclusions from all these different data streams as well. So after this exploratory analysis, we can move on to starting to think about how we can model this data. There are different ways to do that. So here I presented a linear, just a simple linear time series decomposition of system-wide daily bus journeys. Data from every day from fall of 2020 to October of 2022. So the top graph shows the raw daily figures, so you can see very clearly the intraday variation in terms of weekends and weekdays. Below that, we have the overall trend in device journeys, is the one in the middle. So after we remove the weekly trend, the weekly variation, this is what is left. And what you can see that this tracks quite closely with the overall trend that the TDC has been reporting, as well as some of the graphs that I presented a couple of earlier slides as well. Something interesting we noticed here is that even as ridership has evolved over the course of the pandemic, the distribution of the residuals, which is sort of what's left after you account for both the trend and the seasonal variation, maintains a consistent pattern over really the entire course of the pandemic. And this is a pretty good sign for some of the more advanced modeling work we'll be getting into in the near future, since something like having IID residuals is an important assumption that many statistical models rely on. And here is something about data science. This shows that even very simple time series models, such as a time series decomposition, Wi-Fi data is enough to explain this ridership fairly well without leaving any structural or systemic unexplained patterns in the data. We can make this down even further. So we have this sort of similar analysis at now just with data at specific stations. So here's King and Dundas. You can see some pretty clear, from the top, you can see some pretty clear differences in usage patterns, where King has a lot more variation within the week compared to Dundas. And if you're familiar with downtown Toronto, then I think this makes a lot of sense. King Station is right in the middle of the financial district. There's a lot of office towers, a lot of sort of white-collar commuters that King Station serves, whereas Dundas is a lot more discretionary travel. It's beside the Eaton Center, it's beside TMU, it's beside Dundas Square. So it's a very different sort of mixed for purposes. Once again, we can see that the overall trend for each station, again, roughly mirrors the overall trend of recovery. And once again, the residuals also still see sort of not too much of a variation as over the course of the data. Here's two more stations, Queen's Park and St. George. So if you're not familiar with Toronto, these are both near the U of T campus, although sort of on different ends of campus, one's on the south, one's on the middle. And again, you can see some pretty similar patterns in the overall recovery curve, and residuals again are more or less consistent. You might have noticed these couple of spikes in St. George and corresponding dips in Queen's Park, and you're wondering what's going on. So those actually correspond to 3 weeks in 2021 when the TDC shut down actually a chunk of line 1 for maintenance and state of good repair work, including Queen's Park Station. So we can actually, so what this reflects is actually the ridership effect that this closure is having at these stations. So this further affects the credibility of this Wi-Fi data because allows us to very clearly observe this impact these kinds of distributions are having. And in turn, this allows us to potentially account for them in some of our modeling work in the future. Something we're looking forward to getting is some more recent data to see if we can observe the ridership impact that all of the streetcar detours around the downtown core have been having over some of the recent months, and see how riders are being diverted to different stations, if they are being diverted, and in turn see what kind of effect that's having on the recovery for the different recovery trajectories for different stations. So I presented a lot of hopefully interesting charts to you and showed that Wi-Fi is a credible data source and has a lot of value in analyzing ridership patterns in general, as well as investigating the post-COVID recovery in particular. So to recap, we saw that ridership Wi-Fi records are closely associated with overall system ridership, which allows us to use them as a decent proxy. Doing so, we found that overall commuting habits haven't changed much over the course of the pandemic. And it's actually simply more people returning to the system, as opposed to people using the system more frequently than pre-COVID. We also saw that even some very simple time series models can do a decent job explaining and recreating the overall trends and patterns that we saw. And furthermore, they appear to have some potentially good statistical properties that we can take advantage of for some of the future modeling work that we're trying to do. So what's next? We're going to continue to build on some of the preliminary work I just presented. Even though we've shown that even simple models can give some interesting results, we're going to try and extend those with more complex models, such as SARIMA, Bayesian time series, other machine learning models, and so on. As part of that process as well, we're looking at augmenting this raw Wi-Fi data with other metrics such as voxel occupancy, retail activity, potentially travel survey responses to give some more context, but not just where and when, but also why people are traveling. So what trip purposes are really driving this recovery. We're also hoping to extend our analysis to incorporate some more recent data as well, since the city has obviously changed a lot since last fall. The pandemic has changed a lot since last fall. So perhaps there's some new conclusions to be drawn, or there's some other interesting things happening more recently that we can analyze. And once again, the ultimate endpoint we're aiming for is to develop some more fully fleshed out tools, perhaps integrating this work with some of the other Wi-Fi research that has been or will be presented today, that we or other transit agencies can use to forecast traffic trends in more detail, with enough detail for them to proactively respond to demand and more intelligently respond to their overall recovery. So before I end, I'd like to thank my supervisor, Professor Shalaby, as well as David Silva, for helping guide my work and providing a lot of very useful tips and advice along the way. I'd also like to thank BAI for providing this data and providing technical support and answering a lot of data-related questions that we had. Thank you all. So that concludes the presentation, and thank you all for listening. Hope you found this interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. It was it's very cool and very, very interesting. One quick question here. Any idea how the total TTC ridership percentage is today compared to pre-COVID? I know your data is just on subways, right? I mean, because that's where the Wi-Fi traces where you get them. But it's sort of interesting. It looks like the numbers were, you said higher in the weekends than on weekdays, but they still were in the 70–80% range, weren't they?
Yes. So overall TTC system ridership is in the mid. I believe it's in. So if you're looking at the system overall, so all modes combined, it's about in the mid 60s, I believe. Streetcars is a bit lower. Subways is a little bit lower. Buses is, I think, mid 70s. So that's where the imbalance comes from. As for I can go back to this. So what was the question about weekends?
It was just about where recovery levels on the subway were higher. It seemed to be pretty higher than I've been hearing. But.
Yeah. So the weekends, it's lunch because, well, the TTC doesn't, or at least they don't regularly report on weekend recovery percentage. It's they monthly CEOs reports, which is what I'm drawing most of the recovery or the official statistics from. And those only report typical weekday averages. So that's sort of the baseline we have. The baseline here is relative to pre-COVID Wi-Fi records.
Right. Okay, I think we'll stop. There is another question in the Q&A. Maybe you could take a look at it in terms of the tooling that would be required to do the kind of modeling you've been doing. But I want to get our third speaker up and running. So our third speaker is Alaa Itani, and she's been helping out enormously with the whole setup of the TAL Research Day. She's a PhD candidate. She obtained her master's degree from U of T in 2019, bachelor's degree in civil and environmental engineering in 2017 from the American University of Beirut. In her PhD thesis, Alaa is developing guidelines and analytical tools to support on-demand transit and planning and the integration of those. More about herself, she's a foodie and she loves family gatherings, spends a lot of free time reading, wandering in nature, and cooking. Alaa, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brendon, for the introduction. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can. And we can see your slide too.
Okay, awesome. So, I'll be talking a bit today about the work that we've been doing about on-demand transit, but specifically about some of our future plans to model on-demand transit ridership. I will start with a quick introduction about what is on-demand transit, and then I will talk about our previous work that we did to develop an framework to integrate on-demand transit with the existing transit network. And then I will move on to talk more about the ridership modeling and what's the plan of our work. So I like this kind of definition of on-demand transit as the chameleon of the public transportation world, because it doesn't have any specific form. It can change its form in the middle of the service, and it's really very flexible form of transit if we want to look at it. And if we want to look at the word on-demand transit, we see that it is kind of a transit. It's part of the transit system. And looking at the transit system, we like a fixed bus route, collects a lot of trips and move them along a fixed route, a fixed designated kind of line, operating large buses. It can carry a really large number of people, 100+ passengers per hour, for example. And the other part of the words is the on-demand. And when we look about on-demand mobility, then we look about those more individualized trip, less sharing, smaller vehicles, minivans, door-to-door operations, more lower productivity. And here comes where on-demand transit falls somewhere in between those two, which makes planning for it a bit more complex. And as I mentioned, like on-demand transit can really take a lot of form. It's really not one thing. We can have a more structured form of on-demand transit, similar to the on-demand transit connector. And we can think about this where on-demand transit serving the first mile, last mile connections. But we also can have different forms of on-demand transit, which we categorize into the stop-to-stop configuration or curb-to-curb configuration, like think about it like nearest intersection are from or to the major intersection. And the less structured form, which is more close to like what we know about Uber and Lyft ride hailing, is the door-to-door operations. And deciding on which configuration of these that need to be used in a certain network or a certain area really depends on so many things. And that's what comes our work to really develop an on-demand transit integration framework at the strategic, tactical, and service planning level. So we look at the beginning, we look at the transit network design, and how can we include on-demand transit from the very early stages of the design of the network. And then we look at the service planning level at how can on-demand transit solve some of our problems that's more at the like short term. Like we can see from the practice review, literature review that we've done to build all this work that a lot of agencies actually use on-demand transit to replace underperforming fixed bus routes in certain areas. And this is one of these continuous service planning solutions. And I'd like to bring really kind of this pyramid that we kind of built as well to show what could continuous monitoring and evaluation and changes in the bus network look like. So when we look at the middle triangle, and this is the core of the transit network, where these are fixed buses running on a fixed schedule most of the times, and these are mostly viable and like legit and busy bus routes, busy corridors and whatnot. But we can also introduce on-demand transit during off-peak hours or overnight hours, for example, along some of these bus routes. And this is like the pyramid on the top, but we can also have some of these bus routes changing between on-demand and fixed route transit seasonally or month by month. And finally, we can also have some areas where we have on-demand transit running all year long. For example, and these could be areas of new developments, could be areas of lower demand, and so on and so forth. But the common thing about all these changes is the ridership level. And it's not the only driver, but it's one of the main driver of these changes. And here comes really the importance of demand forecasting. So if you look at this figure on the right, and this is kind of summarizes the steps of what we talked about before, the strategic, tactical, and service planning. But we see that demand forecasting and like understanding the ridership of on-demand transit is really a prerequisite to a lot of the work that we've done, and it really affects at the network design. Specifically for on-demand transit, in which areas can we locate on-demand transit, which configuration we are looking into. And at the service design parameters, when we come to the service itself and we need to determine the fleet, the capacity, we need to determine what's the maximum wait time for passengers and whatnot. All this is really determined by the demand. And finally, a good demand prediction will allow us to achieve a good level of service and have a good performance. We need to have a good estimation for a cost per trip. We need to have we need to optimize the vehicle utilization of those on-demand transit trips. We need to minimize the dead time and so on and so forth. So here comes really the need to have some of those demand forecasting models and understand the demand of on-demand transit. And when it comes to these kind of ridership models, like any on-demand mobility services, the supply and the demand are highly correlated and connected. So as an example, if we have 1 or 2 extra requests with an on-demand transit service, this can increase the vehicle kilometers traveled significantly. Think about unlike the fixed route transit. Well, if I have even 10 more passengers boarding and alighting in a certain vehicle, this really will increase the vehicle kilometers traveled even like almost negligibly, nothing. So here comes really the importance of having those models that can capture the relationship between supply and demand, and also the models demand models and statistical models that can help us understand the effect of not only the supply on the demand, but also externalities like the built environment, like demographics, like if there's an existing transit network and the ridership of this transit network, how it is influencing on-demand transit and many other externalities and that we can test with these models. And in terms of what we've been doing in the literature review, we've been trying to look into some of those models, statistical models that work with fixed route transit ridership, and looking also on those models that work with on-demand mobility. Since on-demand transit falls somewhere in between, and from the literature, there's a lot of models, usually square regression models. We have the panel data models that actually reflect the cross-sectional and longitudinal nature of the data. We have the spatial models, because when we talk about these are specifically used with on-demand mobility prediction, where the spatial and temporal kind of distribution of these trips is really important. We have some hierarchical models, as I mentioned, the demand and the supply need to be both modeled with a certain hierarchy. And we are also exploring some of these structural equation models. Just to give you kind of an example of what is a possible modeling approach and to get the idea closer to your minds. So think about a 2-stage kind of modeling approach, where the first stage, well, we try to estimate the expected vehicle revenue kilometers or revenue hours a lot of measures can be used to represent that based on some variables that would affect that, like the population density, the zone size where on-demand transit is operating. And on the second stage, we actually estimate the ridership. Well, it's passenger trips per hour, and also other measures can be used, but we actually use the expected or the estimated supply in order to predict the demand in addition to definitely other important variables that would also affect this demand. So when it comes more to our plan of work, well, we are working with trip data. Trip data records for the year of 2022, including all different 4 seasons of the year. And this is one of the things that we needed to show with on-demand transit, these seasonal changes and how these are affecting on-demand transit ridership. And these trip records really include trip drop-offs, pickups, travel times, wait times, if the trip is canceled or not canceled, what's the estimated versus the actual wait time, the fare. They include a massive amount of information that really can help us so much, and they are disaggregate. On the other hand, we're also collecting supply data, which is more about the operation and the operational characteristics of the on-demand transit services, like their operational policies, the service parameters, the zones where they operate at, and so on and so forth. And finally, we're also collecting other data like about the fixed or existing transit network, the built environment, the demographics, car ownership, for example. And these data, we can collect them from census, from GTS, for example. So all this type of data will help us really build more accurate models. And when it comes to where are we looking our case studies, well, we're planning to have York region and Durham region as our case studies. And York region, if we can look at this map, really is located in the northern of Toronto, and Durham region is at the eastern side of Toronto. And both of those regions, as you can see, they kind of span over a large area covering different types of cities. Like we're talking about urban cities, about suburban, about rural, countryside. And both of these agencies have been operating on-demand transit for quite some time now, and their demand has been stabilizing. They also have a similar mix of rural and urban areas mixture, kind of both have diverse populations and similar demographics. And more importantly, the bus network design and structure in both of these cities are kind of similar. And here comes really our plan with that, of getting those trip data from York region and Durham region across all these different suburban, urban, and rural areas to build different on-demand transit models, compare their accuracy of prediction, and test different scenarios, and then carry on this transferability analysis. So we need to kind of have those models to be general enough to be able to transfer to other cities. And since we have 2 different regions, we'll try actually to carry on this transferability analysis within both regions. And this will really enable a lot of agencies to predict the demand for any new on-demand transit proposal they are thinking about. And finally, after seeing some of the data and talking to these agencies, we know that a lot of routes, bus routes have changed from on-demand transit to fixed route transit and vice versa based on those demand changes. And we would also like to predict and analyze at this level of demand where the change is being done and this switch between fixed route and on-demand transit. So thank you, and I will be happy to take any of the questions.
Oh, thank you, Alaa. I know I've been very interested in seeing how this progresses, because I've been always very interested in integrated planning. And this is an area where demand has been mostly rules of thumb based on past experience, and it's not been very analytical in nature. Are you going to focus primarily on first mile, last mile, in other words, feeding into hubs, or are you going to try to also deal with, zone specific or, zone to zone type service, or will they be integrated? Can you talk just a bit briefly about that?
So based on the data that we will be getting, we will be focusing actually on all the different types of on-demand transit operations. So we're not narrowing it down to first mile, last mile. We will also get into the stop-to-stop, door-to-door, based on the data that we get and based on the operational strategies that York region and Durham region have now in place. And this data will help us more explore like what also different operation strategies we can also come up with. Like the intrazonal and interzonal kind of trips.
Yeah, good. And another question I have is the metrics that everybody uses traditionally are sort of boardings per hour, but that it sort of assumes, it just sort of says all urban areas are basically the same. Here, will you be using, I mean, you may have to develop different metrics such as boardings per hour per square kilometer or something of that sort to get the density in, because it's going to be such an important factor.
Yeah, actually, like a lot of different metrics have been documented in the literature to kind of document this, and it's not about boarding per hours anymore, and it's not more about one metric as well. It's like the combination of seeing those different metrics and like the deadhead time, the utilization of the vehicles, the productivity, if it's per hour, per vehicle, per square kilometer, or so there's so many metrics that have been used, and it is very important that we don't just use one metric to do the judgment with on-demand transit, because it's really very different from what we know about fixed route transit.
I totally agree. Don't see any other questions. Let me just take a quick peek. So I guess at this point you're in the point of where I know you're sort of been discussing about getting the data and so forth, and then there'll be a long phase of just sort of cleaning up the data and trying to come up with classifications and so forth, and then you'll develop the models or test the models that suit the data mostly. Is that right? Is that correct?
Yeah. And we're also kind of discussing a bit like some machine learning model, but the use of machine learning really highly depends on the data and how the data is represented, and a lot how data is clean. And so there's a lot of, factors that come after we really actually have the data in hand to see which models suit it the best.
Yeah, sounds great. Okay, I think that brings us to the end of this session, and I thank all the three speakers. It's been quite interesting. So